Hey everybody, Gareth here with FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today, we're going to be replacing front control arms on a 2017 BMW X5 xDrive 35i. So you see here we have the front control arms, what would be used on an F15 X5. This would also apply to an F16 X6 or an F85 X5M or an F86 X5M. Generally, they all have the same front suspension design. There's not really any variation on these parts, with the exception of the X5M and the X6M, which use different parts, but the general architecture of the suspension is exactly the same. So replacing these parts is going to basically be the same process. We have all of the replacement hardware that we're going to be installing with this, so brand new bolts, also an axle nut, because you do need to push back the axle in order to get one of the control arms out. There's a little bit of clearance issue with the ball joint. But we're going to show you all those steps, all the tricks to get this done as efficiently as possible. But with that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to do this job, and then we'll go ahead and jump right into it. There's a decent amount of tools you're going to need. It's a lot of repeat sizes. Primarily, the specialty ones you're going to want 36mm 12-point socket. That's for the axle nut, because you need to push the axle back in to get yourself some clearance on the thrust arm. 18mm sockets, different sizes, 16mm sockets, different sizes, and 21mm sockets in different sizes as well. So those are the three primary sizes you'll be dealing with. You're going to want the expanding rivet pliers, because you're going to have to remove the cowl cover. 10mm socket along with a T25 for the cowl cover as well. You're also going to want a 27mm 12-point wrench or socket. That is for the ball joint nuts, a little bit of an odd size. You're also going to want a 6mm Allen to counterhold the ball joint stud when you're installing the new ball joints with the control arms. If you have power tools, this also be super helpful. 1/4-inch impact driver and a 1/2-inch impact gun are going to be super helpful in doing this job. Along with that, torque wrench that can do upwards of 420 newton-meters of torque. I have a couple different varieties here. Also, torque angle is going to be something that you're going to deal with. You have a couple of fasteners that are torque angled. So if you have a torque wrench that can read torque angle, that's going to be super helpful. If not, you're going to have to use alternative methods, but primarily if you have access to them, it's going to be super helpful. I also recommend having a brass drift for when you have to knock the axle back in. That's not going to damage the axle or mushroom it. So definitely have one of those as well. And you're going to need a hammer. Yeah, so other than that, we're going to go ahead and get right into the job, and you'll see exactly what you need to do to get this job done. So we have the hood open, and right here, this is your cowl cover. So the wiper transmission, all that stuff is underneath here. Also your cabin air filters are under here as well. On this particular X5, which is N55 powered, so it's an xDrive 35i. If you want to take the valve cover off or change spark plugs or fuel injectors or any of that stuff, you might be able to get away with it, but realistically, this takes up a lot of space, makes it a lot more difficult. So there's a lot of reasons why you'd need to remove this, but we're just going to show you how to go ahead and do it. First and foremost, you have this little weather strip seal right here. Just go ahead and pull it off. Push this off to the side. Now you're going to come with your little push rivet pliers. I like the angled ones for this. There's a little push rivet here. So pull that out, and then there's a bigger push rivet from behind. You're going to remove this as well. Now, if you were just replacing the cabin filters, you can actually just remove this individual panel. Or if you were doing your brake fluid service, you can remove that panel over there as well. But we're removing this entire piece. You have this little retention clip here in the middle. You're just going to kind of pull this up, and then you have a locking tab here on the side. So there's a little opening here. That's where this spring clip locks onto. So you depress that, pull this up, and then you have this tab here on the back side that you'll just lift up, and it'll pull itself off of this upper cowl cover. So that's out of the way. We put this off to the side, and now we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Similar situation, again, you have a really big rivet kind of tucked in behind here next to hood lift support. Coming here with the angled push rivet pliers, pull it out one piece. And then you also have one more over here. So slightly different position than the right side. That's just because of spacing requirements. This one over here is probably easy to miss if you're not looking for it. And now we can go ahead and remove this as well. So again, you have this little tab back here, just gonna lift up on it, and the whole piece will slide out of the way. All right, next we're gonna go ahead and remove our cabin filter housing, which is right here. It's just held in one little clip. You pull up on that clip, and the whole thing will come out in one piece. That clip I pulled up on is just this one right here. It just snaps into the housing. All right, now we can start to remove some of the larger pieces. So we're gonna start with the T25. There's 6 T25s back here at this top piece, so we'll go ahead and remove those. With those 6 T25s removed, this whole panel kind of just lifts up and out. It does clip into place pretty good, so you're gonna need a little bit of force to remove it. See these 4 holes here, you have to kind of just lift up on it, but they snap into these little stands pretty good, so you just need to lift up to get it out of there. On this panel right here, we have 2 10mm fasteners and 2 T25 fasteners, so I'll go ahead and remove those now. And then your 2 10mm fasteners are right here and right here. And now this section comes right out. Similar game, we got 2 T25s back here. And then we have this electrical, this wiring for the wiper motor. We're going to move out of the way. That one might vary depending on the car that you have, but just be aware that that's there. One more T25 here. And then we have 1 10mm down here. Excuse me. And now we go ahead and lift this piece out of the way as well. So as you can see, with those panels removed, you've opened up the entire engine bay. So again, valve cover work, any top end engine work, suspension work. For example, the strut towers are blocked by a lot of this. Even basic services like brake fluid, cabin filters, a lot of these pieces have to come out to gain access. And you do have one additional piece back here, which generally you're not going to remove because this doesn't really obscure anything. But if you did want to remove this, you could as well. Everything is pretty much accessible from this point. So that would be the general process on how to remove this lower section of the cowl. This upper section here, where the wiper is, we'll be doing a whole other separate video on that. So we'll go ahead and link that for you. But this is also another common piece that deteriorates over time, requires replacement. So we'll definitely be touching base on that upper section as well in the future. But primarily, this is strictly for gaining access in the engine bay, so you can take care of common services and maintenance items that you would normally have to do. Again, suspension work or any kind of engine work, you'd normally have to have those panels out of the way. All right, first we're gonna go ahead and remove the wheel, so 17mm. We're gonna start by removing the axle nut. The reason we're removing the axle nut is in order to remove the tension strut, which is the forward arm, the axle needs to be pushed in slightly. So we're gonna go ahead and de-stake the axle nut. And now it's gonna be a 36mm 12 point to remove this nut. To push on the axle, see if it moves, which it's not. Pretty typical. I'm gonna go ahead and thread the nut back on so that it sits flush. I'm gonna go ahead and tap it with a hammer and see if we can get it to move. And it is moving. Now I'm going to take this brass drift and I'm going to hit the stub here. Axle's moving inboard, which is great to see. If it wasn't moving, you might have to use an axle pusher or a gear puller to put enough tension on that to get it to go to get it to start moving. Some of these axles can be a very tight fit in the hub, so if you're running that problem, the hammering technique there might not work. And also worth noting, never hit the end of the stub shaft with the hammer directly because you risk mushrooming it. Putting the nut on it prevents that from happening. Just never hit on it like that. You always want to either put the nut on or use some kind of heavy duty drift to get it to going in. But you don't want to do a situation where you mushroom it, because then it definitely will not go through the hub and then you're pretty much beat. Next up, we're going to remove our splash shield, our main splash shield, and also the outer splash shield to gain access to the inboard bolt for the thrust arm. It's all 8mm fasteners, and then there's a couple of push rivets on this piece right here, because we do need to remove this in order to do the wishbone as well. So we're going to remove all of the things that are in our way on the lower end here. Now removing the outer portion of the splash shield as well. Again, 8mm fasteners, there'll be 5 of them. And now we also have this portion of the splash shield that's in the way. It actually blocks us from getting to the bolt for the wishbone, which we're also replacing. So we're going to go ahead and do that as well. We have a couple of pop rivets here, so I'm going to pull those out. So the ball joint nut, which we're going to remove first, is a 27mm 12 point. I'm using a wrench, or box wrench, to get it going. It's definitely a weird size. It's a very special nut, so make sure you have the correct size tools if you're taking this job on. This might be a controversial way of dealing with removal of these ball joints out of the knuckle. There's a steel sleeve that's press fit into the aluminum. It is a tapered fit on the ball joint, so it's almost a press fit. I found it very difficult to use a normal scissor style ball joint removal tool on this arm specifically, to a lesser degree over here. So I'm actually going to use a hammer and hit the stud of the ball joint. I'm not concerned about the sleeve that's pressed into the knuckle coming out. I've not seen it happen on these. However, if the sleeve does move and it comes out with the ball joint, you're going to have to basically reinstall this and then try to use a different style removal, because that is a press fit. So it shouldn't take much to get these to pop. What's really important is on removal of these ball joints, I see a lot of tips out there that says hit what the ball joint goes through. On this, or any vehicle that has aluminum knuckles, you do not want to do that. You either need to use a scissor style ball joint tool, or you need to hit the stud itself of the ball joint. Because if you're hitting the knuckle with a hammer, I can guarantee you if it's aluminum, you will damage it, potentially crack it. So don't do that if it's aluminum. Please avoid that at all costs. And now the counter hold for the nut, or for the stud, is going to be 6mm Allen. And all we're trying to do here now is just get the nut off. Really important that you thread the nut even with the ball joint stud. That'll make this a lot easier. We're going to take an 18mm socket and wrench, and we're going to go ahead and remove the inboard bolt. Suffice it to say, if you're pulling the bolt out like that, stay out of the way. That's why I was. All right, so here is our new Lemforder thrust arm. It looks like it's aluminum. It's not, it's steel. It just has this kind of zinc coating on it. Also note these thrust arms are side specific. Actually, all the arms are side specific. It's labeled R. The OE supplier on these control arms for the factory is THK, but as far as I know, they don't really supply anything. So Lemforder was the next best choice outside of Genuine. And now we're just gonna go ahead and slip the ball joint into place. Comes with a new nut. And one thing I do want to stress, regardless of what control arms you're buying, I've seen these with aftermarket arms, particularly the non-name brand arms. They will supply you a standard lock nut, not this flanged lock nut like this. And that's a problem for a couple of reasons. If you look here at the knuckle, you can see that there's this steel sleeve on the inside. Your typical lock nut is going to be no wider than that sleeve. So the worst thing that's going to happen, and it's pretty bad, with enough road force over time, this steel sleeve can come out if it's not being pulled into place by a nut like this. This nut sits against the knuckle here, and it kind of keeps everything squeezed together. So whether you bought the arms from somebody else, whatever, make sure it has a nut that looks like this. If it looks like a standard lock nut, for example, something like that, or even a non-flanged lock nut, do not install it. Get the correct nut. I've seen it before plenty of times on the E70 control arms that are available aftermarket. Fortunately, nothing that we supply, but I've seen plenty of photos of the wrong nut being installed in these control arms, and it's a really big deal. So you want to make sure that you do that correctly. We're going to leave everything loose at first here. I'm going to get everything lined up. New bolt for the thrust arm. Now we're going to go and torque everything after it's all installed, because what we need to do is make sure that the vehicle is at ride height. It doesn't make sense to stop, lift it up, any of that. So we'll do that all at the end. We can torque the ball joint nut though. That does not need to be a ride height. Torque spec on these ball joint nuts. This will be for the tie rod, your thrust arm, and the wishbone, 80 Newton meters. And again, 27 millimeter 12 point. All right, now we're moving on to the wishbone. Again, we're gonna torque everything. Once everything is installed, we wanna make sure that we don't put any bind on the bushings. So again, 27 millimeter 12 point is our nut size. Our inboard nut and also the bolt and nut for our strut support are 21 millimeters. And now we're gonna go ahead and break our inboard bolt and nut free. So listen, small disclaimer, this nut, I made a boo-boo. Wasn't completely flush, and well, let's just say I made it into a perma-lock nut. Nothing an angle grinder / cutoff tool or a 3-inch flat disc couldn't fix. So normally, you know, removal of that nut's exactly the same as it would be for the thrust arm we did. On this one, yeah, you could fill in the blanks. Yours truly made a mistake. So it happens. Installation of the new control arm, pretty straightforward. No issues with the axle in terms of clearance on this side, or at least for this control arm. So just kind of take it, ball joint will drop into place. We'll take our nut, thread it on. Oh yeah, a lot of preload on that. I'm just gonna push the control arm up into place, up against the subframe. And for what it's worth, the inboard bolt and the outboard bolt for the strut are the same. The only difference is the lock nut. The lock nut inboard is gonna be a nylock. Looks like that. And again, we're not gonna torque these yet because we need to push the suspension up to ride height. So we're just putting the bolts in loose for now. Once we have everything installed, we'll push it all up into place and torque everything to spec. Now on our strut bolt, I went ahead and put a skosh of anti-seize on the threaded section that's going through the bushing, only because, I don't know if you ever worked on a Honda before and you have the fork in the suspension, you'll know that those bolts have a tendency to seize. And while the bushing here has a zinc plating on it and the bolt has a zinc coating, I would prefer for this bolt not to seize in there from galvanic corrosion. So I'm just gonna put a layer of copper anti-seize on that to hopefully prevent that from happening. You know, it's a situation of it can't hurt to do it, so we're gonna do it. So that anti-seize I applied is only gonna be inside of that, the bore of that bushing. And again, this bolt here is gonna have to be torqued at ride height. So this needs to be torqued at ride height, this needs to be torqued at ride height, and this needs to be torqued at ride height. At this point, all I need to do is just tighten this nut down here on the ball joint, and then we can go up to the upper control arm. And again, the torque on this outer ball joint nut, it's gonna be 80 Newton meters, and it's a 27/12 point. So while we're in here, we're also gonna replace the sway bar links. These kind of wear just the same way the control arms do, and they can create a lot of noise. So in this case, it's going to be a T40 counter hold with an 18 millimeter wrench, both at the lower and upper mount. Same thing, the upper stud goes through the knuckle, 18 millimeter with a T40 counter hold. Sway bar links are side specific on this car, so there's a right and a left. The parts are going to be marked accordingly. The nut at the upper mount where it goes through the knuckle has a washer on it that can physically spin. That needs to be up top. And everything's gonna be the same size, so 18 millimeter nut with a T40 counter hold. All right, so now we're gonna move on to the upper control arm. One thing to note about these upper control arms, sometimes you'll have a level sensor that's attached to them. On this passenger side of the car or right side, we don't. But on the left side, we do. So when you're removing this upper control arm, you need to be aware of that. First, we're gonna start by releasing this outer ball joint to the knuckle. This has recently been out, so I expect it should come out relatively easily. However, you might have mixed results. You might notice that this upper bolt is difficult to remove as well. It's not unheard of for a corrosion to build up on the bolt, basically pinching it in place, or for corrosion to be on this ball joint stud also. pinching the ball joint in place. So because this was out recently, it should come out no problem at all. But depending on how long it's been installed, depending on the conditions where you are, you might have an issue here. The key takeaway here is if the bolt is not spinning, don't try to force it, because that means it's in there pretty tight from corrosion, so just be careful with that. And now we're just going to tap up on the we're going to tap up on the control arm. I'm just using the plastic side of the dead blow hammer here. And it is up. Now we're at this point. One thing to mention before you start loosening any of these bolts, you're going to want to measure the height that this control arm rebounds to. So basically from the top of the ball joint all the way up to the inside here of the wheel housing, you'll want to measure that gap, because this has been torqued at ride height, and it's going to be very difficult to torque this at ride height once everything is installed. So what you can do is, while you have everything apart, if you have this measured, when you reinstall the new arm and the new hardware, you can basically set it at this height already and not have to worry about accidentally preloading the bushings in the wrong place. I'm just using a bungee to hold our knuckle in position. I don't want the inner CV joint to pop out or anything like that. Ball joints actually feels really stiff on this. This is nice. One thing to note too, if you have a camber problem on the front suspension of this vehicle, there are special arms that BMW sells that allow you to either increase or decrease front camber. And then there's also some aftermarket arms that have an adjustable ball joint that allows you to change the camber setting on the front. From the factory, there is no camber adjustment. It's pretty much just static the way it is. But you know, if there's some kind of weird thing going on with your vehicle where that setting is off, you can change these control arms to try to get the alignment where it needs to be. In this case, this car doesn't have an issue, so we're just putting in standard replacements. All right, we got a tape measure here. Basically just measuring from the outside of the ball joint up to where it touches the wheel housing. So we're basically, call it 11.5 inches, almost 12. So you could do this as well. There's a couple different places you can measure from, but I'm going to measure from the same place. And then we're going to make note of this when we install the new arm. Yeah, we're going to call that 12 inches, lock that in place. So we'll keep that measurement, because once we loosen these inboard bolts, it's gonna basically droop down, and we want to make sure that we set the height on this to where it is currently. So I'm going to put some load on the suspension to compress the coil spring, just to get a little bit more room. Got the bolt out. And that was a very tight thing. BMW, they want you to lower the strut to be able to do this, which we're not doing. So you can get away with it by working with the car a little bit. Now we're going to take our new control arm. These are side specific. Now we're going to try to get this bolt, this forward bolt, in first, because that's what we had to do. That was the last one to remove, so the suspension is still in a compressed state. We're gonna let the suspension lower now, so we can get the other bolt in. All right, now we're gonna take this other bolt and try to do the same maneuver. That went in a lot easier. Count that as a blessing. And so now that you have the bolts in, we're going to set the position of this control arm in terms of height. And to do that, really gonna need some assistance. So basically I need somebody down here holding this arm up at the height that we talked about, roughly 12 inches. And then we're gonna have somebody counter hold one of these bolts. Once one bolt is pinched, so basically the nut and the bolt have pinched up against the mounting points, this won't move anymore. So we need to set the ride height on one side first, and then we can go ahead and tighten both bolts down and torque them to spec, and then reassemble. So it's really important to have an assistant during this job. Normally Ethan, who's the guy behind the camera, is now the guy wrenching underneath. Again, bolt size is 16 millimeter. I suppose you could try to do this solo, but it would honestly be a lot harder. So having a friend for these upper control arms, super useful. Torque spec on these upper bolts is 38 newton meters, plus the really inconvenient torque angle of 90 degrees. So, you know, give you all this room to not work with, and then you have to torque angle it. So went ahead and we're installing a new pinch bolt. Went ahead and put some anti-seize on the shank of the pinch bolt to hopefully reduce any potential for corrosion. I'm sure that this car will see a shock replacement again in the future, or an upper control arm replacement. So if we can prevent that upper control arm from seizing up, or that upper control arm bolt, pinch bolt, from seizing up because of corrosion, that would be ideal. Torque spec on this pinch bolt is 56 newton meters. Torque spec for our tension strut bushing to subframe is 100 newton meters plus 90 degrees. We're doing our wishbone to subframe bushing. It's going to be 165 newton meters. There's no torque angle on this. 21 millimeter. Torque spec on our control arm support mount is going to be 140 newton meters plus 90 degrees. So a whole lot. Torque spec on the axle nut is 420 newton meters. Now that everything's been torqued, I'm gonna give it a pause. Chupapa Mugnano, take two. Now that we have everything installed and torqued, we're gonna go ahead and start reinstalling the undertray since we don't need access underneath anymore. So again, it's just a matter of a whole bunch of 8mm self-tapping screws and a couple of pop rivets here and there. So now we're going to go ahead and reinstall all the parts that we removed. So, you know, after you have done any of the work that you needed in the engine bay with the cowl removed, now we're going to go ahead and just reinstall it. So it's kind of the opposite of what you did to remove it, but we'll go over some of the details. We have an electrical connector on this side. Just going to go ahead and make sure that kind of clips back into how it was before. And that is everything on this side. Now we're going to go ahead and install the right side, which has basically all the same T25 and 10mm fasteners, just different quantities. The T25 fasteners are going to go back here in the rear, and the 10mm fasteners are going to go here towards the front. Installation of the air filter is pretty easy. Just make sure that you line up the tabs and then it'll click into place. If it doesn't seem like it's fitting correctly, it's probably because it hasn't sat flush on its mounting. Also, that probably won't click into place. So once it clicks into place and everything looks even, it's properly in there, and you can go forward and put the last panel on. All right, so that's all the steps you would need to do to replace both of the lower arms, so your tension strut and the wishbone, along with the upper control arm. Really, the biggest takeaway from here is, especially with the upper arm, it's going to help if you have somebody, particularly when you're removing the bolts and installing the new ones. And it is super important to make sure that that upper control arm is torqued at a ride height. So measuring where that control arm is from the factory, the gap between the ball joint and the upper and the wheel housing there, you're going to want to make sure that you have that information before you go ahead and tighten the new one down. But other than that, it's relatively straightforward. Not really too difficult. Definitely follow the torque recommendations and make sure that you torque all of the bushings at ride height. You don't want to put them in a bind, which could cause premature wear. But other than that, relatively straightforward. Definitely something you could do yourself if you're mechanically inclined, but even if you're going to have somebody else do this for you, at least you can see the process and understand the work that's being done. But as always, I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, leave in the comment box below. Hit that like button if you like this video, and also hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.